Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Mennonite Central Committee of British Columbia virtual winter dinner. My name is Jet Takaoka. I am the Advancement Director here at MCC BC, and yes, I am new, so this is the first time we get to meet for most of us. But on behalf of all of my colleagues, thank you for taking the time this evening. This evening, you will hear from our colleague Shelley Jewick as she interviews one of the MCC area directors, Bonnie Clausen. And then a little bit later, you will hear from our executive director, Wayne Bremner. From our beginning, over 100 years ago, MCC has helped and still helps refugees, displaced people in places like Ukraine, Syria, Lebanon, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, El Salvador, Colombia, and many other places around the world. People who are displaced, forced to flee because of drought and famine, because of conflict, because they cannot make it where they are. Many of us watching this evening have experienced dislocation and relocation, or it's part of our family history. The fact is, refugees, displaced people are near and dear to the heart of God. If we read our Old Testament, Genesis chapter 12, we remember that Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees to head to a land that God had not even identified for him yet. Later, Abraham's 12 sons, they left Canaan to go to Egypt. They were looking for food security. They were fleeing from a famine. Subsequent to that, Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, fleeing bondage, persecution, and suffering. Further in the Old Testament story, we read about people like Naomi, who left the land to go to Moab, again fleeing famine. And there she met Ruth, who would become her daughter-in-law. Ruth left Moab to come back to the land with Naomi. Ruth became the great-grandmother of David. David, from whose family Jesus would be born. And then when we read the gospel story, we read how that Jesus, along with his parents, Joseph and Mary, had to flee. They also fled to Egypt. They fled a murderous tyrant who was out to kill every baby boy under the age of 2. Then later, in the New Testament letters, the Apostle Peter refers to believers as strangers and aliens here on earth. God has a heart for refugees, for displaced people, for migrants, for people on the move. And so tonight we will see some pictures and hear some stories of refugees, displaced people in our world. But we won't just hear about the need. We will hear about the resilience, the hope, the belief that there can be a better future. And so together we will have an opportunity to make a difference for people in our world. Throughout the evening, we will have an opportunity to give. An online giving link will be displayed on your screen. Or if you're watching this tonight, we are here live at the MCC office in Abbotsford. You can call 604-850-6639. Thank you again for joining us. Please enjoy our presentation.
Hi, I'm Annalie Giesbrecht, and I'm the Advocacy and Communications Coordinator for MCC in Latin America and the Caribbean. Just before COVID-19 arrived in Latin America, I had the chance to travel to Quito, the capital of Ecuador, to learn about how MCC is supporting displaced people there. While I was there, I met Gilchen Davalillo and her little baby boy Matias at the Quito Anabaptist Mennonite Christian Church, where MCC supports a refugee response project. Gilchen and Matias are from Venezuela. They fled the economic crisis in their home country, and they're trying to make a new life for themselves in Ecuador. I met Gilchen at a training on reusable diapers, part of the project that's supported by both MCC and Mennonite Mission Network. The reusable diapers are great because they not only meet an economic need for new moms in Ecuador, who might not be able to afford expensive disposable diapers, but they're also environmentally friendly. Over the couple days that I was able to spend with the Mennonite Church in Quito, I was so impressed to see the caring, individual attention that Gilchen and other participants receive from the project coordinators. The work they're doing is so important, and it's possible because of your support for MCC. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Shelley Dueck. I've coordinated winter banquets for the last number of years, and it is good to be together again. I had the opportunity to speak with Bonnie Clausen, the Area Director for South America, Mexico, and Cuba. She's also served in Colombia for the last 19 years. Please listen with us as Bonnie shares about how MCC supports refugees and people on the move.
Thanks for joining us, Bonnie, and sharing a bit about your experiences and work as you serve with MCC. You and your family live in Bogota. What have been the greatest impacts of COVID-19 over the last year?
Oh yeah, Shelley, COVID-19 has been really hard in Colombia. I think Colombia has been one of the hardest hit countries in Latin America, and the impacts have been very deep. I live in Bogota, which is a very large city, and we faced extremely strict lockdowns for around 5 months at the beginning. In that sense, only one person in the family could leave the house ever, and that was for grocery shopping and banking strictly. Other than that, everything was closed. Parks were closed. Transportation out of the city was closed. Office and schools were obviously closed. There was just nowhere to go. So my family was in our 9th floor apartment building for months without leaving. And that's what life looked like for many, many, many Colombians. I took joy in watching the sunset every day. That's what brought me joy. With all the changes and the limitations, every sunset was beautiful. So we found ways to find beauty every day. But it was hard. It's been hard. It's still hard. And there are many other major impacts that will have a long-term effect. There's so many businesses that have closed here. For example, in the back patio of the MCC Colombia office, we are storing the remains of a few families' small businesses, like hairdressing, chairs, pots for cooking from restaurants. And it kind of feels like we're storing people's dreams. Well, they don't really have any access to make them real again. That's hard. Rural Colombia has generally been less affected, gratefully, but the challenges in small towns and rural countryside areas is that just the complete lack of medical services. So if somebody does get sick, there's really very few options other than hoping and praying that they get better. Of course, those that don't have homes are even more vulnerable.
Bonnie, it sounds like this past year has been a very challenging time for you and your family. I am grateful that you've been able to hold onto moments of beauty in the midst of the pandemic. As we move into hearing about the work that you have been engaged with over the last number of years, I'm curious to learn more about how MCC and our partners show compassion to people on the move. How does MCC support partners in Latin America that work with refugees and migrants? And what is the difference between a refugee and a migrant?
Yeah, there's many words that are used for people who leave their homes, who are uprooted and have to try to figure out how to travel and live in an entirely different culture and context. And often there's different words that are used based on why people leave and how far they travel, especially if they cross national borders, and how vulnerable they are in their journey. I think in MCC, we're increasingly using the word migrant for everyone who leaves home under certain pressure, recognizing that the pressures that push people to migrate can't always be like really easily categorized. Technically, a refugee is someone who flees to another country under imminent threat to their lives. Perhaps it's because of individual persecution for political, ethnic, gender, or religious reasons, or because of massive, widespread armed conflict or a tremendous level of devastation due to natural disaster. On a global level, there is a special legal protection for refugees because they're fleeing to another country where they're not citizens, and that makes them particularly vulnerable. But each case is unique. I know of a Mennonite brother and pastor here in Colombia who was threatened at gunpoint because his community work became an obstacle for the armed groups in his region. But even though this threat was imminent, he decided not to leave his home. But his choice doesn't mean that the threat wasn't serious and others should have left. Or on the other hand, there's many people that live in contexts where there's no viable way to put food on the table for their kids. They don't have a gun to their head, but does the fact that there's no viable way to live, the fact that they will die slowly, mean that the threat is less real? In MCC, we pay attention to those who are most vulnerable. That's sort of our underlying concern, regardless of other issues. So who are these most vulnerable? Well, they're people with little economic resources, people with few relations or family members in another place where they could go to, people who are journeying with children or elderly or people with special needs. It's those who face discrimination because of race, religion, or gender when they arrive, people who don't have passports or recognized status, people who have experienced deeply traumatic events before or during the journey. Those are the people that are most vulnerable. And I think it's important to note that not everyone migrates north, as we say. Not everybody is trying to get to Canada or the United States. Most people at risk move to another location in their own country, and we could call them internally displaced people. Many others go to neighboring countries. Hondurans and Guatemalans travel to Mexico. Nicaraguans go to Costa Rica. Venezuelans cross into Colombia. Colombians go to Ecuador. So on. That's how people are moving. When people are migrating, they make decisions on where to go, largely based on the personal resources that they have in order to travel, as well as where they have family and friends that could receive them. Last of all, they think about where they'll receive the most protection and opportunities.
Thanks, Bonnie. Who does MCC partner with in accompanying these people on the move? And can you share an example of how a church has supported refugees and how refugees have transformed the church?
Sure, of course. In Latin America, MCC partners mostly with local churches and church-based programs. Primarily, that's with Mennonite Brethren, Mennonite churches, Brethren in Christ churches, although we also work with other churches, including Catholic parishes. And MCC provides funds and sometimes personnel. The local church program then provides a variety of services and support for migrants. This could be food and shelter, hygiene kits, pastoral and psychological support, orientation about what options are available, legal support, a variety of things. And these local partners are just so very knowledgeable about what resources are available in the community around them. And they're very good at mobilizing volunteers to support the programs. I also believe that the foundation of faith is very important for migrants. And when I say faith, I'm not talking about a specific denomination or a very specific theological perspective. I'm talking about faith writ large. Migrating is an act of faith. And it's really beautiful when local churches can connect with the vulnerable through this bridge of common faith. Faith that God will make things better. This is also very transformative for churches as they broaden their understanding of what faith means. And I could give many examples of this. I'd like to share about the Mennonite church in Riohacha, Colombia. It's located very close to the Venezuela border. To just illustrate the scope of the situation that this church is responding to, it's worth noting that there are close to 5 million Venezuelans that have left their country to seek viable living conditions elsewhere in the region in recent years. And the Riohacha church near the border is on the path where many migrants would have to pass through, and of course some of them stay. The pastor of this church is a really highly energetic, 70-year-old woman named Maria de Melo. For years, she has been running a home for abandoned elderly people in her town, and she has volunteers that support this work, other women in the church. But when the Venezuelan migrants started to arrive and pass through their towns and sleep in the open parks, Maria de Melo began actively looking for ways to open the doors of the church to care and to show solidarity. Initially, the Colombian elderly who were already living in the home were a little bit crusty towards these migrants, and that reflected the prevailing political climate against Venezuelans in Colombia at the time. But the giggles and games of all these little Venezuelan children soon turned the original inhabitants into these doting adopted grandparents. The migrant families became family for the elderly, and the church became a place of connection. They were transforming stereotypes, they were taking down barriers. Unfortunately, during these pandemic times, it is harder to make the connections, but the church is still finding ways to bring people together. So MCC is providing funds to ensure the basic functioning of what now has become a community kitchen. And in our budgeting and planning process, we've agreed with the Mennonite Church that we'll provide resources to feed around 70 migrants twice a day, every day of the year. Yet somehow, when Maria de Melo reports back about what they're doing, we find that they're consistently feeding more than 100 people a day. I think about what happens around the world with migrants. There's governments and people that keep closing the door to migrants with that fear that, well, we don't have enough. We don't have enough for our own. We can't help more people. You know, I think in reality, most of the poverty around the world isn't really poverty. It's the result of inequality, where few have hoarded the world's resources, and there's not, with this idea that there's not enough. The Rihuacha Mennonite Church really never operates out of that mentality of scarcity. The church always starts with generosity. Recently, one of the MCC Colombia program coordinators, Carolina Perez, was visiting Rihuacha, and she went with the church volunteers to a community event in the park. And after she came back, Carolina told me, we went to this event, and she said, we expected around 80 people. So thinking a few more might show up, we bought these large sweet buns for about 100 people. But 150 people showed up at the park, and Carolina said, I was the person passing out the sweet buns, and I know that every person took one. But we still had leftovers. This does not make mathematical sense. You see, the church has chosen to live out an economy of abundance instead of scarcity. And we keep seeing that the loaves and the fishes are multiplying. We don't have any reason to live in fear. We can welcome, we can open our doors.
And Bonnie, what are the future hopes of refugees and people on the move?
I think in listening to migrants across Latin America, in Mexico, in Central America, in Colombia, in Ecuador, what we've heard from migrants could probably be summarized in 2 words, and that would be dignity and roots. People who migrate have had to sever their family, relational, and cultural roots, and that is just so extremely painful. Just imagine a rootless plant, and you can think about how easily that is to destroy and how it just blows away. Migrants need to be able to integrate into community. They need to be able to be included. They need to be able to build relationships wherever they can settle. They need to be able to do this in a way that honors the roots of their past, and they need to be able to create a new identity that doesn't destroy or offend their old identity, their roots from the past. And I think that also has to do with the other word, with the word dignity. All people on the move just essentially dream of living with dignity. You can think about what dignity means for you. Perhaps it varies from one person to another to a certain extent, but I think in the end of the day, it means that you have enough to meet your basic needs and you're not needing to decide, do I eat or do I have a shelter over my head? Do I send my children to school or do we have clean water? Not having those needs met, that takes away dignity. Dignity also means being valued and treated like humans in a way that others are treated. And dignity grows out of kindness and a recognition of people's capacities and worth, because we all have capacities and we all have worth. In that sense, I think people in the move are simply hoping for dignity, the way that all people hope for that.
Thank you, Bonnie, for sharing with us. Again and again, I am inspired by how MCC and our church partners continue to choose to live with a perspective of abundance and generosity, sharing with all those that come and are in need. Thanks for joining us, Bonnie.
Thanks. It's really been a pleasure to be part of this space.
Thank you, Bonnie, for being part of our program this evening, and also for your work with MCC in Colombia and Latin America. We really appreciate working together with you. Today, around the world, we're facing an unprecedented refugee crisis. There are 70 million people around the world in different countries who have been forced to flee from their homes. Most of this is due to violent conflict. It's the highest level since World War II, when conflict swept around the world. The same is true in different ways in many countries today. In Syria, 10 years ago now, pro-democracy demonstrators were asking for better conditions from their government. In response, there was a violent crackdown by the government, causing massive destruction of communities and people's lives. Out of a population of 20 million people, 12 million have been forced to flee their homes. 6 million fleeing from one community to the other in Syria, and the other 6 fleeing to neighboring countries. MCC is hard at work in neighboring countries like Lebanon and Jordan to assist those who have been forced to flee. And we're also active through the local church and other organizations in Syria to meet the basic needs of people who have fled from one community to another in order to escape the violence. In Ukraine, right after the Olympics in 2014, unmarked Russian forces moved into Ukraine in the eastern part of the country as well as the Crimea, causing violent conflict. Over 2 million people were forced to flee their homes. 500,000 fled into Russia, and the remaining 1.5 million fled into different parts of the Ukraine. MCC today is working in partnership with local organizations to help meet the basic needs of people who've been forced to flee in the Ukraine. And we're working with the Mennonite Brethren Church in Ukraine to reach into conflict zones with basic human needs. In Colombia, innocent villages are caught between the conflict between drug lords and paramilitary forces, often forced to produce crops for the drug trade when they really would rather not. MCC is there, together with the local church, helping provide alternative crops for market, as well as providing education for children and peacemaking initiatives. In Congo, conflict between warring factions have caused massive migration for decades. In recent years, over 1.5 million people were forced to flee rural villages from one area to the other. And MCC was there, working together with different Mennonite churches to provide a refugee camp that assisted with the basic necessities of life, such as food, shelter, and medical care, as well as education for children who are now going to be living in refugee camps, sometimes for years to come. Thanks to your support, as well as the work of our staff and our local partners, people who have been uprooted from their homes are experiencing love and compassion. Together, we are meeting immediate basic human needs, as well as building hope for the future. Normally this time of year, we would be hosting our winter banquets in person across the province and having an opportunity to meet with many people that we don't get to see very often during the year. As we plan for the fall, we're still hoping that we might have the MCC Festival for World Relief in person. As we enter the year ahead and continue to work with the restrictions of COVID, we ask for your continued prayers of MCC, for the work we're doing here at home, but especially for the impact of COVID in many of the countries where we work overseas. But most of all, we want to say thank you. So many of you are volunteering and giving with MCC on a regular basis, volunteering in our thrift shops in many different ways, coming to our Material Resource Center and making blankets and relief kits, or coming out and helping make the Festival for World Relief the great event that it is. We want you to know in the many different ways that you have supported MCC over the past year, that you are making a difference in the lives of uprooted people in many forgotten places around the world. Thank you.